inevitably, when a crash like this happens a few months after DHL packages caught fire in Leipzig and in Birmingham, and European intelligence agencies suggested that that might have been a kind of Russian proxy operation, that suspicion would fall on Russia in this case too. And what the Lithuanian security authorities are saying is maybe. We can't rule out Russian terrorism. It's definitely a hypothesis, but right now it's way too early to make any attributions or even really to establish how the crash happened, and it could well have been human error.
Okay, well, let's talk about this this plane crash in Lithuania. Very, very close to the runway. Not close enough, of course. It's ended up killing at least one person. But this DHL flight came from Leipzig, the same city as where the incendiary device caught fire at a DHL facility earlier this year. That wasn't it, at the time due to be put on a plane, and there were suggestions that, you know, if it had been on the plane, then the plane would have undoubtedly crashed. I would imagine this feels too great a coincidence for this to be two accidents, and is that the working hypothesis in Lithuania?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's not just those incidents that are in the background. It's also the way that we've seen data cables between Finland and Germany and between Sweden and Lithuania apparently sabotaged in the Baltic Sea last week, and a much broader background hum of Russian sabotage across Europe. Everyone is on edge about this issue. It is definitely happening. It's happening with greater frequency and intensity than it was before this year. So inevitably, when a crash like this happens a few months after DHL packages caught fire in Leipzig and in Birmingham, and European intelligence agencies suggested that that might have been a kind of Russian proxy operation, that suspicion would fall on Russia in this case too. And what the Lithuanian security authorities are saying is maybe. We can't rule out Russian terrorism. It's definitely a hypothesis, but right now it's way too early to make any attributions or even really to establish how the crash happened, and it could well have been human error.
If it does prove to be that this is Russia's doing, what exactly is the game here? How does this chaos that they are being accused of help their cause, I guess?
It's actually a really good question, because I'm responsible for a lot of the eastern flank states that have really been in the firing line of Russian so-called hybrid warfare for many years now. What is the overarching strategy behind this? And the answer is that a lot of it is just kind of displacement activity organized by lower levels of the Russian intelligence services and their associates in the criminal underworld, just basically trying to kind of justify themselves to their superiors. If there is a kind of long game from the Kremlin's perspective, it appears to be this idea, first of all, that this is a way of throwing Europe off balance, of sowing uncertainty. It's very cheap as well. So compared to other more obvious forms of escalation, like firing an interregional ballistic missile, it's very kind of straightforward and throwaway. And then the other thing, of course, is that it's all very deniable. So it gives Russia a means of escalating against the West without it being obviously attributable as an escalation.
And then you mentioned that there's, you know, the other ways that they seem to be causing this chaos in the West with the undersea cables as well. How do they have access to? I mean, they're two vastly different ways of causing chaos, aren't they? You know, I suppose undersea cables are undersea cables. Anyone in theory can get down there, but in practice, that seems like not an easy thing to do. And similarly, maybe even more so, to get into DHL facilities and somehow sabotage them. That is proper organisation required to do that, I would have thought.
Well, in these cases, we're talking about two very separate MOs. What appears to have happened in the Baltic Sea is something very similar to what happened about 13 months ago when the Baltic Connector gas pipeline between Finland and Estonia and another undersea electricity cable between, I think, Sweden and Estonia were torn open. And in that case, it was apparently a Hong Kong flagged oil tanker called the New Polar Bear that had allegedly lost control of its anchor and dragged it along the seabed. And in this case of the most recent cable damage, it looks like that is the working hypothesis that another Chinese cargo ship called the Yipeng 3, which may or may not have had Russian crew on board, dragged its anchor across an area of seabed very close to where the Nord Stream pipeline explosions went off 2 years ago. In the DHL incendiary case, what appears to be happening is that these packages are posted from within the European Union. In the case of the first two packages, they'd actually come from someone in Lithuania. And they're basically just kind of testing what they can get away with, is the hypothesis, to see how far these things get through security before they might catch fire.
And you mentioned in your piece that there is another hypothesis that this is potentially a rehearsal by Russian intelligence for a possible attack on a transatlantic flight. Now, I would imagine, again, that's a cargo flight rather than one that any of our listeners might potentially be on. But it sort of doesn't matter, does it? And that would be a whole new level of escalation if there is any truth in that. Do you think there's intelligence behind that, or is that just this might be the natural conclusion as a sort of thinking idea?
It's hard to tell. This suggestion that a transatlantic flight might have been the ultimate target came in an article in the Wall Street Journal from a very good investigative reporter who has extremely good contacts in European intelligence agencies, but I haven't been able to independently verify it through intelligence contacts myself. So I'm a little wary of it. And obviously, it was addressed primarily to an American audience who need a reason to care about it. So I don't think that should necessarily be the kind of primary focus of the issue here, which is fundamentally that we are now seeing attempts to plant incendiary devices on cargo or passenger planes in Europe.
And can I just ask you about Lithuania's sort of relationship and stance on Russia? Would they be classed as sort of West-leaning, or are they one of those that has a bit more sympathies with Russia?
They're not just West leaning, they are West fixated. The kind of central purpose of the Lithuanian state since the country regained its independence during the collapse of the Soviet Union has been to anchor it in NATO and the European Union in order to prevent a repeat of the Soviet occupations of 1940 and 1944, which were absolutely brutal. And so Lithuania has been not just an extremely enthusiastically pro Western country like the other Baltic states, it's also been at the kind of vanguard of Western foreign policy in terms of seeing what a small state can do against much bigger aggressive powers, particularly China.
Well, there's another country that I guess you might have described in, to a degree at least, similar terms in Romania, who may well, in the last few hours, effectively, have completely changed their stance. Tell us what has happened in the first vote in the Romanian presidential election.
This was an absolute bolt from the blue for me. I was on news duty yesterday when the election started, and I looked at the polls and I thought, well, this is going to be a pretty straightforward contest between a liberal and a social democrat that isn't going to change anything. So I didn't even mention it to the editors. And then what happened was overnight, this independent, hard right, very, very stridently anti EU, anti NATO, kind of Kremlin curious figure called Kalin Georgescu, who had previously been polling as low as 0.4% of the vote and hadn't even kind of appeared on the graphs charting um, voters' preferences for most of the campaign, suddenly had this absolute surge in support and appears to have finished the first round in first place with something like 23% of the vote. Of course, it's not sort of nailed down that he's actually going to become president, because we have to wait for the second round runoff when he's against a Liberal candidate. That'll be on December the 8th. But if he does win that, then it has very serious implications. Romania being one of the kind of pivotal eastern flank states, hosting part of the US missile defense shield in Europe, hosting a French led NATO multinational group, also having been under the previous president, Klaus Johannes, a pretty good NATO ally, to the point where Johannes actually made a bid to become NATO's Secretary General earlier this year. And if you do have a guy coming in as president who describes the US missile shield as a shame of diplomacy and says that Romania should be following the Russian way and adopting Putin's economic policies, then it's potentially a kind of second Hungary within NATO and the EU, with the caveat that, of course, while the president does have significant foreign security policy powers, he would also be in tension with a more kind of centrist and pro-Western prime minister.
It has a huge, almost kind of a double border, doesn't it, with Ukraine, with sort of Moldova splitting the two sides of the border. Potentially, would a Georgescu presidency be, at least to a degree, another Belarus as far as Russia is concerned with regards to the Ukraine war?
No, I think Belarus is putting it too strongly. I would look much more towards a country like Hungary or potentially Slovakia under Robert Fico, where you have a kind of populist, Moscow-leaning figurehead. And again, as I mentioned, because of the separation of powers in Romania, he wouldn't necessarily have the same authority that Orban does in Hungary, for example. The parallel with Moldova is very interesting, because it too had a presidential election at the end of last month and the start of this month, where there was probably the most untrammeled and spectacular program of Russian election interference I've ever seen, where Russia was spending, and its proxies were spending sort of, upwards of $100 million on buying people's votes. And in Romania, it's not really clear whether we have seen anything like that. We have had warnings from the security authorities and from MPs about cyber attacks and about networks of pro-Russian bots on social media. But there's no evidence, as far as I'm aware, as yet, that Romania has been subjected to anything like the intensity of Russian meddling that we saw in Moldova.
I wonder whether the numbers don't really even add up with regards to Russian interference. I mean, it's one thing to influence an election to a degree, but if he was polling at 0.4% and got well into 20%, as it were, that seems almost a level that any interference potentially couldn't manage.
Yeah, I mean, the counter arguments to that would be, first of all, the polls clearly weren't very good. And this guy was running on a very strong anti-establishment ticket more broadly, not just in terms of foreign policy, but arguing that Romania's mainstream parties had just lost touch with the concerns of the electorate. The second argument would be that what we saw in Romania was that even in Moldova, was that even with this massive attempt by Russia to put its hand on the scales, it didn't work. Maya Sandu, the pro-Western president, ultimately came back by a very kind of reduced margin of the vote, and very heavily depending on the support of Moldovan expats. But all the same, she won. So a shift of sort of 10 or 20% in the polls with a kind of concerted enough campaign of interference behind it might be conceivable, but I think the jury's out on that one in Romania's case, and I'd be pretty wary of pinning it to that extent on Russia for the time being.
You mentioned that Romania hosts this French-led NATO multinational battle group, and then the US missile defense installation. Would NATO immediately feel obliged to pull out of Romania under that? Not in terms of sort of membership, of course, but in terms of it hosting battle groups, for example? And would America potentially have to rethink too when if you have someone this hostile at the head of a nation?
No, I don't think that would be the case. For NATO, Romania is not just an important base for projecting power onto the southern end of its eastern flank, it's also a very important conduit for naval and aerial surveillance over the Black Sea, being so close to Ukraine. So its strategic value is so big that I think NATO would be very, very cautious about pulling out just because the head of state happens to dislike it. Um, the more interesting question is whether, should Georgescu come to power, which we don't know yet, he might try and sort of pull the rug out from under the feet of the NATO deployment. But again, that would just be speculation beyond the kind of evidence base that we've got at the moment.
And just finally, I'm going to ask you to try and get into Donald Trump's head, because we know that he is somebody that wants either a lot more spending within NATO or potentially, to sort of distance America from NATO if that doesn't happen. Obviously, Romania has been one of those nations that has pushed their spending well beyond 2% actually of GDP. I think it's closer to 2.5%. Do you think Trump would rather keep a member who is hostile to NATO, or actually would he potentially appreciate a bit more, I guess, hostility within the body itself?
I mean, during the first Trump presidency, we saw from figures in his administration, such as John Bolton, a lot of discomfort over other Eastern NATO allies, particularly Turkey. That didn't really have any kind of long-term consequences in terms of their position within NATO. I think it wouldn't be so much be Georgescu's position on NATO that would attract Trump as this idea that Trump is the spearhead of a kind of pan-Western right-wing populist shift. He would see himself as the kind of biggest emblem of a movement that includes figures like Fico in Slovakia, Orban in Hungary, the kind of previous Kaczynski administration in Poland, Janusz Janša in Slovenia, and I imagine if I were inside his head, I would be vaguely gratified if Georgescu came to power, assuming I could find Romania on a map of Europe.